Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Stephen Styer. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam, Paul. Very happy to be here.
Thank you. And I'm in London. I think you're in Egypt at the moment.
That's right. I'm speaking from Cairo right now. So, yeah.
Amazing. Well, you actually have sunshine. I envy you. So to the topic of our podcast. Perched at the possible edge of World War III, the issue leading us there, and by which our age will likely be judged by future generations, is the Israel-Palestine conflict, or the Israeli attack on Palestine. And here with me today to discuss the Jimmy Carter position is Dr. Stephen Styer, who's former lecturer at Oxford University, where he taught courses on classical Islam and religions. And his research now is focused mainly on Islamic education, as well as tradition and modernity. Jimmy Carter is not merely another voice, but a former president of the United States, whose interest in the topic was not merely while in office or to please the fickle voters. His Christian position is a testament to how current US government positions have departed from a previous consensus, and why that is. It is also a Christian perspective on how one can support and remain sympathetic to Jews and Israel, yet follow the ethical evidence wherever it leads, even to condemnation and pressure to change policy. Carter, speaking on matters before October the 7th, largely blames a weak US stance for the deterioration of the situation, human rights abuses, blood spilt in the Holy Land, and the two-state solution becoming more and more unrealizable. Even mainstream figures such as Colonel Douglas Macgregor refer to the situation as the tail wagging the dog. Carter's book is around 200 pages, including many maps and several appendices with legal documents, including UN resolutions. But before we can assess his position, Carter's position, we need to first understand the issues, and Dr. Styer will summarize them for us. So over to you, sir.
Paul, so first of all, thank you for that dazzling introduction and to the topic. And I think for the participants here, it'd be fantastic if we could actually roll that video so they can. Some of them won't know who Carter is. So before I introduce myself or say anything else, let's hear from Carter.
Yes. Okay. So this is the video. I'll just play.
Yeah.
Word apartheid is exactly accurate. You know, this is an area that's occupied by two powers. They're now completely separated. The Palestinians can't even ride on the same roads that the Israelis have created or built in Palestinian territory. So within Palestinian territory, they're absolutely and totally separated, much worse than they were in South Africa, by the way. And the other thing is, the other definition of apartheid is one side dominates the other, and the Israelis completely dominate the life of the Palestinian people.
Why don't Americans know what you have seen?
Americans don't want to know, and many Israelis don't want to know what is going on inside Palestine. It's a terrible human rights persecution that is far transcends what any outsider would imagine. And there are powerful political forces in America that prevents any objective analysis of the problem in the Holy Land. I think it's accurate to say that not a single member of Congress with whom I'm familiar would possibly speak out and call for Israel to withdraw to their legal boundaries or to publicize the plight of the Palestinians, or even to call publicly and repeatedly for good faith peace talks. There hadn't been a day of peace talks now in more than 7 years. So this is a taboo subject, and I would say that if any member of Congress did speak out, as I've just described, they would probably not be back in the Congress the next term.
Who are these forces that you're talking about?
Well, there's an inherent commitment in America, which I share as a Christian, of a deep commitment to make sure that Israel is safe and that Israel is free, and that they can seek for peace. So there's a strong inclination for all of us to support Israel's continued existence in peace. And that is headed on to by the very effective work of the American-Israeli group called AIPAC, which is performing its completely legitimate task of convincing Americans to support the policies of the Israeli government. And AIPAC is not dedicated to peace. They're dedicated to inducing the maximum support in America, in the White House, in the Congress, and in the public media for whatever policies the Israeli government has at a particular time, and they're extremely effective. AIPAC, I think, was organized in the distant past, I think, when Eisenhower was president.
Okay, but perhaps we'll leave that there. But that was very powerful words indeed from former President Carter, I must say. And it's so refreshing, indeed even surprising, to hear such a prominent political figure in the United States speaking so objectively and fairly and courageously on this issue. I just don't hear this at all. We've got an election coming up in less than 2 weeks in the United States. Neither of the main candidates could remotely be expected to speak this kind of language, let alone anyone else. So it is quite refreshing, to put it mildly, to hear Jimmy Carter uniquely, perhaps. So I know there are fringe figures, perhaps the Green Party candidate, but he's a mainstream figure, the head of the Democrat Party, obviously. So it is remarkable, I think.
Yes, so he had that capacity to lead and to bring people together, but he still that doesn't require him to be blinded by ideology or simply not knowing the facts on the ground. And when you so there's a dynamic here. When you don't know those facts, you can't bring people together. This is something that we'll say about Carter's personality, and that he said about himself and others have said about him. There are academic experts on Jimmy Carter, like Dr. Mary Elizabeth King, who we're hoping will come together as part of a panel in the future. So he has that capacity and personality as a mediator. Now, we might believe that that's motivated by the virtues inspired by his Christian faith, but whatever it is, he has that capacity without losing sympathy for the other side. And that's actually prerequisite for getting people at an honest bargaining table. So the many other points related to what he said will come up, but the dynamic is that there is a constraint, particularly on the American polity, and that trickles down to the public. And I'll be saying things when I turn to his to the summary of his actual book, which is one of the benefits that we hope to take away from this meeting, is that people don't have to plow their way through a 200-page book, but they'll still know what he says. And I think, as you'll see when we get into the introduction, the summary, that we need a summary, but we need the details, because without the details and the granularity, the position becomes flavorless and it's inapplicable to the complicated situation. So I think that when he's speaking to Jews or to Christians or to Muslims and Arabs, that they feel that he's not merely stereotyping, that he's not merely forcing them, right? And for our part, I hope in the future that a panel would include Palestinians, because we don't have the right to speak on their behalf in certain matters without allowing them to represent themselves. It's the same for Jews and Israelis. Are obviously not the same thing, but we have to be sympathetic to their fears and their concerns as well. We're not interested in creating another echo chamber and contributing to a polarized discourse, right? So we have this affective polarization, which we're almost all shaped by, but I think it's more extreme in certain countries. And my own experience is that in the United States, where things are being determined, right? Because, you know, as Scott Ritter and Colonel Douglas McGregor and countless other experts would say, this whole expedition would be over in 6 weeks if the bombs didn't keep coming in and being supplied, right? Yeah, so this is, some people would go so far as to say that this is America acting via an instrument, and I'm not saying that at the moment. It's not my position to say it. So just to lead in to the actual introduction, Paul, I have a few points, and I should say a word or two about myself, particularly in the sense that my wider family is the United Nations. We are the United Nations. So we have practicing and passionate Jews, Christians, Muslims, and within the Christian faith, Catholics and Protestants. So, yeah, that has you know, brought certain issues to my awareness, and also even just to make me reflect on the discourse. So myself, I am a British American. I do hold a British passport, and read at Oxford and subsequently lectured there. And while there, I received with Professor Avi Shleim, and everyone will forgive me for the pronunciation of their names, but we received a delegation of Christian priests from Jerusalem, but also Moroccan rabbis who had very good things to say about their experience in Morocco. And I consider these types of experience narrative breakers. So the typical narratives in you know, the UK or the US, that these are the types of elements that when a truth seeker sees them, they have to revise their views after you're exposed to certain realities. So, yeah, so I came back to this point, and also I'll come back to this and the specifics of those experiences later, because they're all very telling, and a number of things occurred that are quite significant. So I began to, over the last year, work to improve my own education on this topic. And I have to say that there were some incredible videos here on BT, Paul, and I thank you for that.
Alhamdulillah, thank you.
But I think that the mature approach of Carter is so valuable. It's his character. You know, I watched him do a book review and debate effectively at Brandeis, very intense, right? But now we see in this current event, because you know we're talking a gap between 2007 and 2024, that there's a growing group that we would call pro-truth and justice, not pro-Israel or Palestine, right? And obviously in the U.S., with the polarization that is just a habit, it is a mental habit of the vast majority of the citizens there, to just immediately label anyone that's sympathetic with the Palestinians as being pro-Hamas. Okay, and that's yeah, you know, I don't want to throw out labels, but it's not Carter's position, and his character rises above that, and I would encourage all of us to do that. So as I engage with real people in not only America, but let's say primarily there, I realized that people were setting about from different premises, and I wanted to study their premises. If they are approaching it as a Christian Zionist, let's see if that Christian Zionism matches the New Testament. And if it doesn't, then let's re-examine our principles. So what we see there, as well as an affective polarization, we could call it a vindicative spirit. Everyone trying to vindicate themselves. And I would describe that as an attitude displaying itself through being committed to defeating one's interlocutor utterly. But it has a radical spirit of wishing to undermine and remove and destroy them. So it almost has these elements that we would attribute to the Soviet Union and their mode of political engagement, which is not a civil discussion, but rather an attempt to undermine. So that's how our political culture is working. But so we might think of culture wars, cancel culture, effective polarization, where emotions and identity are at stake and discussion of issues becomes almost impossible. So one sees emotional eruptions that occur when you cite evidence that conflicts with another's identity. So gone are the days, perhaps from 1970s, 1980s, where the Israel-Palestine issue was debated with a degree of civility in American universities. We still have the Oxford Union, which has more than one such debate, one involving Avi Shlaim. And it was polite, not that both parties were looking for the truth. And this is a big issue. I think we can cite certain people out there and say their discourse shows that they're not truth seekers. And yeah, I have a couple in mind. I'll save that for later. So one investigation that I made after seeing the spread of the influence of a preacher, Pastor Gary Hamrick, was into Christian Zionism. And that happened near the time that I ran into Carter's book. So when I read Carter, I found a middle way, as the video will that we've just played there, where he makes his Christian commitment to Israel clear, yet he does not allow this to prevent him from practicing prophetic wisdom or even universal wisdom and hearing both sides. So I have to hear both sides before I judge. And B, it doesn't prevent him from having sympathy, something that we don't seem to be able to have for the other side. So it's crucial to see that Carter, that his conversation is pre-October 7, 2023. These are all very important points. As you said, the interns were headed almost for World War III. So just a couple more points here. So in Carter, there's the example of a said middle way in which support for Israel does not entail denial of human rights, nor, as the American Jew Dr. Mark Braverman, that I encourage everyone to watch, described in a presentation for the Methodist Federation for Social Action and the United Methodist for Kairos Response. The way he described the situation is that why should people be giving so much interest to this issue, aside from the issues that you mentioned in the introduction? And one is that it's the only place in the world where visible human rights abuses are being not only excused, but justified and motivated by the Bible and Christianity. So, yeah, so he expresses that when he returned from discovering the situation in Palestine to his Jewish community, that they closed their doors on him, right? So he's presenting with Christians and explaining to them how the sentiments surrounding the Holocaust frees many Christians from being able to say that's right and that's wrong. It's very simple. So now you have to give Carter a chance to lay out his wares and share his highly personal and deep experiences of engaging both sides. If you do, you'll see that we're further along now in our time. You can compare it with our time and see we're further along into a post-truth age. So most of us are committed to beliefs that were we to take 15 minutes rather than checking our stock portfolios or doing some form of work or entertainment, and to listen to good arguments on the other side, not always present, admittedly, that we could not believe what we're actually believing and committed to. Okay, so I'll just wrap up by saying that Carter's position has its own value as a historical document. So just as do the memoirs of Yitzhak Rabin, Nahum Goldman, the longtime president of the World Zionist Organization, or other figures that penned whole volumes about their lives and the experiences that they had. They are a record of events that are unknown to most of us. We weren't there. So his book, Carter's, is a sophisticated book, not without gaps, but I'll focus on two positions of Carter that are crucial for any hopes for peace in the region. Number one, a minority of Israelis rejected the premise of swapping land for peace and pursuing settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So again, they rejected the premise of swapping it and instead pursued gaining settlements. Okay, this will come out in the book itself, as I said. So Carter describes this as a hawkish turn that was appealing to the more religious element of Israeli society. So we have to bear in mind that the land being swapped is of the remaining 22%. So we're not negotiating the other 78% in Carter, right? So we're talking about of the 22% of historical Palestine, swapping some of that land which has been settled, or even lands that are under a military occupation since 1967, giving that back and allowing the Palestinians to be fully self-determining there. Okay, which Carter says that Menachem Begin emphatically agreed to in his presence. And B, the other element in the dynamic here that I think is key to focus on is that particularly in America, the discourse is one-sided due to the power of AIPAC. So the American Israel Political Action Committee, which exerts enormous influence not only in American politics but on the media, so the positions are never heard. I'll just throw out one theme that comes up, which is that when you study the events as they're portrayed in America, and if you actually listen to the ministers and the Knesset in Israel, you realize that there's an incredible whitewashing that's gone on. If you just listen to them directly, what they say, it's a very different discourse. So why are people locked into that? So the position of AIPAC, as Carter says, is not a push for peace. He said that in the video, but to maximize support for any policy of any Israeli government under rule of any U.S. political party. That's also what an expert on this topic at the University of Chicago, John Mearsheimer, says. So this means that the U.S. media, and I will just wrap up here, Paul, this means the U.S. media is far more one-sided than Europe, and that on many topics, only one voice is heard in American media, that of Jerusalem. CNN has to have the IDF approve its statements, right? And that's CNN. So this makes America unable to perform its crucial role as deal broker for peace. And as Carter says, no negotiator can be in the pocket of one of the two sides in a negotiation. So here's Carter's forte as a negotiator, mediator, and arguably as a righteous Christian.
Okay. Thank you for that. Well, shall we have a look at some of these slides? This is the book, of course, that you've been referring to, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. So it's extraordinary. He explicitly refers to the Israeli regime as apartheid. And then paradoxically, I mean, one might argue that the consensus view about apartheid South Africa was the regime had to go, had to be dismantled, and there had to be a just political system to replace it, and reconciliation between the various different groups, the white minority, the black majority, etc. But this language would suggest that the Israeli regime needs to be dismantled because it's apartheid, and yet he then praises AIPAC for being a very legitimate, very completely acceptable group. He seems to go out of his way, and then he also supports Israel, wants Israel to be safe. Very clear, he wants Israel to be safe and secure. But would he use that language? Would he have used that language about white apartheid, South Africa? So it's a genuine question. I don't understand the logic of his position. If it's like apartheid, or even worse, actually, he's also said that, how can he then at the same time say, we want Israel to be safe, we want Israel to be affirmed, we want Israel to be as a Christian, I affirm Israel. It seems to me an inherent. I don't understand the logic of his position, to be honest. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is the most direct way to answer that, but I think that as Mark Braverman said when speaking to the Methodist Social Action Committee, I need to review the name of it, but he, as a Jew himself, expressed that it's in the DNA of post-Holocaust Jews to have this fear, right? And he gives an example of a
Let me just pause you. A fear of what precisely? You said post-Holocaust
right.
Jews.
What
are they afraid of? So I ask this because Jews don't feel safe. You hear Americanly, they don't feel safe. They need their own homeland to protect them and so on. What they're saying is, it seems, I could be wrong, what they seem to be saying is they're not safe in America. They're vulnerable in America. They should leave America because they're not safe and they need to go somewhere else. That means America is an unsafe place for Jews. And yet I would say they're very safe in America because they're in positions of power. AIPAC is by far the most powerful lobby group in Washington. This is not the status of a group of people and their allies who are not safe in the United States. So again, they're not safe where? They're not safe in the UK? I mean, seriously? I mean, they are safe here. No one's persecuting them. No one's calling for them to be whatever. So this fear, it seems to be kind of a generalized, unfocused, existential vulnerability. But the largest concentration of Jews in the world outside of Israel is in the United States, the one place where they do have power, it seems. So again, I don't understand the logic of that position.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you pushing back on this, Paul. And it's a very good point because we want all sides to be represented here, and that'll be easier with a panel. But I think that I've heard answers to this that are quite relevant. So first of all, we have to remember that, and not just talking about Jews or Israel, but we are talking about Zionism here, which is the belief, and in its most stripped down sense, the commitment to producing an Israeli state and homeland where Jews feel safe today. So even if things were to shift, right? Because there's a British rabbi that I think up to the age of 16 or 18, he lived in what he calls Palestine, right? And he would say that Israel is the least safe place on earth for Jews today.
Well, this is obvious. They're at war. I mean, they're being attacked by Hezbollah. They've been attacked by Hamas. They've been attacked by Iran.
Yes.
If they were to live in New York, they would not be in that situation. Of course, a very, very large number of Jews do. No, I take a point. Israel is a very insecure place because it's not just occupying just land and real estate. They are actually occupying Palestine, which is not their territory. Historically, it's been obviously where Jews and Christians and Muslims live together peacefully in Palestine. That's what I'm trying to say. Historically, for centuries, under the Ottomans, for example, Jews and Christians, they were Arabs. You had Arab Jews, you had Arab Christians, you had Arab Muslims. And to be an Arab is not, as I'm sure you know, an ethnic identity. It means you're a native speaker of Arabic. So you had Arab Jews and Arab Muslims and Arab Christians living peacefully together for many, many centuries. But now this has all changed. Since the advent, I think you're saying, of Zionism, you had this completely new element in that place, Palestine, which is causing all this friction between what are now called Jews, who are not Arabs, they're usually from America or Russia or Europe, and the indigenous population, the Palestinians. Yeah.
So you've raised a lot of good points there. I'll try and briefly throw out a few points. One is that Braverman says that because of that fear of a repetition of the Holocaust, the Jews that settled and then eventually formed the state, and they effectively had a military before the formation of a state, and it was a formidable military, and it's just gone, I'm not saying it completely, but from strength to strength. So they feel this need and a fear, which makes them sense that they need this fortress. There are historical ironies, of course. Number one is that Theodor Herzl, who basically sold this, at that time, there was no such thing as religious Zionism. It was strictly secular, and the entire Orthodox community condemned because of Talmudic commentaries on the Song of Solomon, which, you know, I'd be happy to prepare that for the future, or maybe have a speaker on it. But it was not there was it was an oxymoron to say religious Zionism. So and they were exploring multiple locations, so that's known to many people, that they explored placing the homeland in the United States, for instance. They explored South America. They explored parts of Africa. But what took the imagination of primarily initially the British, and then the Americans started to have a role in it, was the best writer on this, to my knowledge, is Ilan Pappé in his 10 Myths book, not the ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, cleansing. Yeah.
So there he says that there are three factors, right? And you know, that's getting us into another topic. But how did they find the sympathies in secular British, in religious British, to come together as a coalition? It took three different sympathies from, and they're mutually exclusive. You know, the secular British, it was either the Prime Minister or someone very high up at that time. We're not talking here about Balfour, but we're talking about people whose ideologies were in utter conflict, and yet they made a coalition that allowed this to happen, right? So there's a bit of fate in it. So they ended up there. But I think what Carter would say immediately is you have to look at it's a cliche. You have to look at the behavior. Yeah, you have to take some responsibility. And Carter will call for this several times. He will say, you know, people are so quick to say, oh, Arab terrorist. You know, it's just, it doesn't require an argument, as Noam Chomsky and others would say. But he would say, let's be honest and mature and take responsibility for the hatred that we've created through the blind, one-sided support. And it doesn't help. It's not in the benefit of Jews. It's put, you know, it's building a nest and then continually putting your finger. It's like someone said, if you want peace, if you even claim you want peace, then how can you keep building settlements? How can you keep taking more and more land? You know, you're stealing from the person as you're claiming to be negotiating with them. So he would say we have to take responsibility for that. Yeah. I don't know if that answered that.
Yeah, no. Let's move on to the slides, perhaps.
Sure. Okay. Right. So yeah. So Paul, I'll begin with the introduction to. This is a summary of Carter's work, and then there's a sort of a summary of the summary at the very beginning. And I think, again, that this would be a valuable educational tool. And I would be happy for anyone that's interested in carrying on with this discussion or being part of it in the future, even to contact me at Stephen@middleway@gmail.com. To discuss or to contribute and collaborate. So saying that, let's begin with Carter's book.
Yeah.
And the summary of the summary. So I'd like to first highlight the heart of Carter's position before we turn to the rich details of his book. So Carter contends that polling over decades has consistently shown that the majority of Israelis and Arabs want a peace deal, described as land for peace, meaning that occupied and settled parts of the 22%, not the 78%, remaining to the Palestinians. That is the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. These are three terms that we need to be familiar with. That they be returned to them to achieve a lasting peace. So leaders of both parties have resisted this. Keyword leaders. Aside from a few like Anwar Sadat and Yitzhak Rabin, both of whom paid for their brave peace efforts with their own lives. So after Rabin's assassination, and I'll comment on the way that came about later, Carter claims that the will to swap land for peace persisted until the Labour Party went out and the Likud party came to power.
Right.
And Israeli politics made a great swing to the conservative right.
Yeah, yeah.
He also says hawkish, right? Even then, Prime Minister Menachem Begin, it's written Begin, but it's pronounced Begin, had the courage to strive for peace. Though this later changed, and he was barely willing to reopen any form of discussion, or even literally physically turned a cold shoulder to Carter.
Wow.
And so Carter, when he became president, he researched the official U.S. position and that of the presidents before him, finding that they all supported UN Resolution 242, which requires something of both sides. From the Arabs, that they acknowledge the state of Israel, and is for Israelis that they end their occupation of these three segments of land: the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. It's very common for these to be referred to as Samaria and yeah, it's just slipped off the tip of my tongue, right? But in other words, to refer to them in the terms from Jewish history. So history shows that a deal requires strong brokering from the United States. This is the heart of Carter's message. But instead of the United States using the power it has through Israel's reliance on it for financial aid, military aid, and we've seen all of this again and again, even in this conflict, and political support, AIPAC, the American Israel Political Action Committee, has managed to stifle the efforts of numerous American presidents and leads to such a one-sided debate in the United States that the other side of the equation is not fairly represented, if represented at all, and hence no negotiation is possible. That is the heart of Carter's book, and he repeats it in more than one place in the book.
Mm-hmm. So these stats here, what year were they? Presumably that was quite a while ago, if they're from his book.
So these statistics are showing that the trends that Carter's talking about continue, right? So if we see, even in Gaza here, the majority, if there is one, right, because it's 37%, but it's higher than any others, they want a peace agreement, not even an unarmed struggle, right? Yeah. Which reminds me that one expert we hope to speak to in the future is Dr. Mary Elizabeth King. She worked with Carter for perhaps not just the 4 years he's been president. She also has a book on the Intifada, which Carter writes an introduction for, making the point that this is peaceful resistance, right? When a 7-year-old throws a rock at a tank, or just march, right? And the people that marched in an unarmed struggle, they were routinely shot or imprisoned. People have to understand that, and I'm not justifying any of the particulars. I'm not even talking about the particulars of October 7th. That's a topic which deserves people to get right, and there's a lot of very good discussion of it now. But the point is that before October 7th, there were strenuous efforts for peace, and as Carter will say, Israel has the upper hand. So and the voice of the Palestinians has not gotten out, and that's partly changed in this current conflict. Yeah. So, Paul, if I did manage to answer your question there, maybe we'll get into the chapters of the book.
Carry on.
Very good. Okay. So I'll go ahead and read the chapters from the book itself. That's a standard element of a book review. It just helps people place things. So chapter 1, well, he starts with a historical chronology. And, immediately when you start to put things in place, you realize that many Americans who want the best for Jews in Israel, they defend those beliefs with things that can be disproven in a matter of seconds, right? So his historical chronology, his list of maps at the beginning, it's a very valuable book. Chapter 1, Prospects for Peace. I'll just read the titles. My First Visit to Israel, 1973. My Presidency, 77 to 81. The Key Players. Other Neighbors. The Ronald Reagan Years, 81 to 89. My Visits with Palestinians. The George H.W. Bush Years. The Oslo Agreement. The Palestinian Election, 1996. And I don't talk about Oslo, so I'm just going to chip in one point very quickly on that. Carter, when he appears at Brandeis to debate his book, mentions that at the time of the Oslo Accords, all 23 Arab nations agreed to recognize Israel. And the Crown Prince Abdullah of Saudi Arabia at that time was interviewed and asked, what do you mean by acknowledging Israel? He said, the way that we treat any other Arab state, we would treat Israel. So that is what was being offered for the 22% of land, which is legally Palestine. It should be given statehood, and that's not a gift. That's not that's their right. It's what remains of their land, even if the international community effectively and it's an irony for any of those who get into the topic. It is the Palestinians paying the price for European anti-Semitism. I think that's just fair for everyone to say and see it that way, which is that because of the horrors and atrocities that were committed by the Germans, which were one of the most advanced Western European nations, they're many people just want to say it was a horrific outlier, or they were outcasts or whatever. This is where German and Enlightenment philosophy reached its peak, right? So I mean, there are people that say it took with Hegel and others that German philosophy took a wrong turn. But this is something I researched at one point to show that Nazism and what the actual soldiers were reading, what's in their pockets, it's Nietzsche and whatnot. And this is where Western philosophy led to. Their crime, plus the fact that the British would not allow more than a very small number of Jews to move there after the Holocaust. So even after World War II, it's European anti-Semitism. It's all the blood libels over the centuries and whatnot. It's So this is an extremely important topic, is to identify, where is anti-Semitism, because there are, now sort of evangelical preachers that are claiming that Arabs are just the latest anti-Semites, and it's ridiculous when you look at the history. I'll come back to that. So my visit with Palestinians, George Bush years, the Oslo Accord. So the fantastic opportunity the Oslo Accord was. The Palestinian elections in 1996, Bill Clinton's peace efforts, the George W. Bush years, the Geneva Initiative, the Palestinian election in 2005, Palestinian and Israeli Elections 2006, The Wall as a Prison, and a summary, which is fantastic, and afterward, which is fantastic, and 7 appendices. So it's a it's a very readable but yet detailed book. Yeah. Okay, so the rest of my presentation will track the chapters that I just mentioned of Carter's book. So Jimmy Carter and his wife, the late Rosalind Carter, who was part of all of his humanitarian efforts, visited the Holy Land at a time when the various parts of Israel thrived, with open borders to Jordan and other surrounding countries. So this is Carter with Golda Meir.
So who was Golda Meir?
She's on the right. She's the only female Israeli prime minister. She led the Labour Party, which is relatively secular.
So yeah, she wasn't part of the current Likud party in power.
No, the Likud party came in, as far as I understand, with Menachem Begin, and then with Israel Sharon. There's another party which will constitutionally allow land to be swapped, and I have as part of the slides the statements that are coming from the Likud party website, and I think that's very instructional. So she's the one who invited him, and he made his Holy Land visit, including a lot of sites that are here, and I have some pictures of the borders being open, but I think this is more important. So the Labour Party, a tolerant Israeli government, was in power at the time that he made his visit to these places. Headed by Israel's only female prime minister, Golda Meir. Meir arranged for Carter's travel, which included visiting the holy places in Jerusalem, Hebron, Nazareth, the Jordan River, and the Sea of Galilee, but also the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the Dead Sea. Alongside his narration, Carter comments on several events that occurred during his travels. He notes that he raised the issue of the settlements to Golda Meir, hoping that they would be dismantled, and says that Golda Meir stated, "There's no separate Palestinian people." So he comments that he assumed that she meant that there would be no racial delineation between Jews and Gentiles. And he shares his inner thoughts to this point. This is the Sea of Galilee. Mm-hmm. This is the border crossings, and here you have Ottoman pashas, and but you'll see the reason for this slide in just a minute. So he says, I have to admit that at the time I equated the ejection of Palestinians from their previous homes within the state of Israel to the forcing of Lower Creek Indians from the Georgia land where our family farm is now located. They had been moved west to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears to make room for our white ancestors. In this most recent case, although equally harshly treated, the taking of land had been ordained by the international community through an official decision of the United Nations. The Palestinians had to comply. This is the Trail of Tears. And I'll come back to reading this in just one moment. I think what's relevant here is the movement of the Palestinians and what's now been called the Nakba.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Palestinians had to comply, and after all, they could return, he says, and be compensated in the future. And they were guaranteed undisputed ownership of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. Okay, and those that know the Balfour Declaration will notice that it says that nothing of the granting of the state to Israel will be impartial to the rights and requirements of the Palestinian people. So these are in many cases, well-known images. And this is where people end up, right? They end up in tents.
I mean, still do in Gaza.
Yes, and 80% of Gazans are refugees from this exact event, and these people were raised in tents. And you know, I'd like to go ahead and read just a couple sentences here from this plaque. Sorry, just going backwards, Paul, to get to that plaque.
Yeah.
Skipping. Here we go. Yep. Okay. So the forced removal of the Creek Indians from their homes in the Chattahoochee River in the West, weakened by starvation, defrauded of their lands, and swindled of their most of their possessions, thousands of Creeks or Creek Indians, including some in chains and shackles, made the forced journey from Alabama to what is now Oklahoma, where many of their descendants now live. So Alabama also remains the home of many Creeks today.
It's interesting that both the United States and Israel are both, they share that historical commonality, that they are both nations founded on a dispossessed people which were forcibly removed from their land. And maybe that's another reason for the great solidarity between the US and Israel, that they have that rather unusual characteristic. They are both ethnically cleansed, the original inhabitants, to make way for their superior, in inverted commas, civilization. So there's supremacist narratives, exceptionalist narratives in America and in Israel. And so this is what the West does. It's part of its history, really. And France did it with Algeria, of course. Algeria wasn't a colony. This is misunderstood. It was part of France. It was actually a region of France itself. It wasn't like a colony, like the British had the Indian colony. So it was settled there by settlers, colonial settlers, who actually lived in, inverted commas, France, what we call Algeria. So, of course, that was unsuccessful. Ultimately, there's a vast war there that got rid of the French, who were occupying Arab land. And so we have a similar situation in Palestine, where the inhabitants are trying to deal with a similar situation.
Yes, as you know, well, there's a couple points there. One is that Roosevelt had an ideology that allowed him to accept this, which is manifest destiny.
Right.
There are people who will point out that, in fact, David, the Jewish doctor David Braverman, points that out, that the slavery in America was often Bible in one hand, whip in the other, but also even in South Africa, that they did view themselves as masters. I'd like to actually go into that more properly in another video. And obviously, you know, you do now have this element of Western modernity that's very critical of that tendency. And that's why many people say that the project now, because this also goes back to your point about what are you going to do with leaders that are committed to an ideology that doesn't fit the time that we live in, right? It's out of place. So, you know, and many people would say that it's anachronistic. You know, even now, Zionist can simply mean someone that supports having the country of Israel, that they're not committed to the original doctrines. But that happens decade by decade, and historians need to look at it. And many people would say that, you know, things like the Iron Wall that Carter has a chapter on, that you can go back to Ben Gurion and find these ideas already there. But how do you interpret that? That is a big issue. And part of what I love about Carter is that he builds his argument for a better world on things that can't really be argued with. And I do sometimes myself feel that he pulls his punches. But if he has to do that to get everybody to the table, then then I can respect that. So Carter also notes during his travels in Israel that he noticed the empty synagogues at prayer times, and he commented on this to Golda Meir at the end of his visit, saying, "I had long taught lessons from the Hebrew scriptures, and that a common historical pattern was that Israel was punished whenever the leaders turned away from devout worship of God. I asked if she was concerned about the secular nature of her labor government. Surprised at his temerity, she dismissed his question with a shrug and a laugh, noting that Orthodox Jews still exist." Just, you can tell her attitude in that, which is something that Theodore Herzl said. He looked at Orthodox Jews as backward, but a potential that they could go through a transformation of secularizing.
Right.
In the surrounding decades, American presidents were never far from peace talks. The basic premises Mr. Carter names are, let me just catch up a little bit with the slides here. There is a bit of a, there we go. There's a glitch here.
Odd. Is it stuck at 20? Yeah, there you are. If you let me move it, see if
yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So is that where we want now, the British mandate in Palestine?
Yes, and yeah, there's the statement about the establishment of the Jewish homeland, that nothing shall be done with which may prejudice existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Okay, so
Also was completely ignored. And it's interesting, I mean, I know it's obvious, but the Balfour Declaration clearly states that Palestine existed, because it's quite common for Zionists today to deny it ever existed, when the British government certainly knew it existed. And they support the Balfour Declaration, but then they deny the very premise of it, which is the establishment in Palestine of a ... So you want to have the cake and eat it, really. But also, if Balfour had known what would happen, would he have ever agreed to this? Because of course there was an extreme threat to the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, in terms of the Nakba, which you mentioned, and other things.
But we also have to consider that the nation state is a human institution that occurs certain times. So just because they weren't registered in somebody's book of nation states doesn't mean that there wasn't a nation there. Secondly, if anyone would like it, I have Shimon Peres's passport and his visa that he was issued. So he entered Palestine on a visa and had a Palestinian passport. So and then helped to overturn the state, right? So when I discuss this matter with people, I like to point out that there's layers, right? There's something called private property that I think we can agree on, liberals or monotheists or Abrahamic whatever faiths, and it's part of our contemporary legal framework. And secondly, there's the authority of an existing nation state, and so both of those basic rights have been overturned in a way that if we imagine it unfolding in America, right, that a certain number of Chinese land on the western coast of California, and they start to set up, buying property there, that's fine, right? But taking property is not allowed. Neither is it permissible legally to overturn a state. You're in someone else's state. You're operating under their legal framework. So, I'll just carry on with Carter here. So the basic premises that Carter turns to when he moves from his visit to the Holy Land to the peace talks is that First, at the UN Resolution 242, stating the 1967 borders were to be honored. When he reviewed this process, he found that is a basic premise that everyone agrees upon. And second, although it's not being discussed now, second, the Palestinians must have the legal right to self-determination within these borders, composing 22% of the Palestinian British ruled mandate before the 1948 UN resolution to partition Palestine. And yeah, so here's again just maps showing the percentages of land. So Carter at this point stops and treats the reader with a number of elements of the background information that are needed in order for us to be intelligent participants in a democracy, or even just ethical agents. When Britain conducted a census in Palestine in 1922, there were around 84,000 Jews, 670,000 Arabs, of whom 71,000 were Christian. By the time the area was partitioned by the United Nations, these numbers had grown to about 600,000 Jews, 1.3 million Arabs, 10% of whom were Christian. During and after the 1948 war, around 420 Palestinian villages in the territory that became the State of Israel. So the part that became the State of Israel in 1948, in that part of the territory that you can see on the map here, within that 420 Palestinian villages were destroyed, and some 700,000 Palestinian residents fled or were driven out. There are some documentaries on the details of the village called Tantura, and there are rapes that occurred, and there are videos again, which I have copies of, that of people confessing to watching their friends commit rape, and showing that it was known, and unfortunately laughing about it. These videos are still around. So Carter's own peace efforts were largely with Anwar Sadat, a close lifelong friend of Carter. Sadat came to Carter to express his will for peace, and eventually gave his life for it. Yitzhak Rabin also gave his life, being a moderate killed by immoderates. And the very final slide I have here, Paul, I'll just jump to this. Chris Hedges, who was a friend of Rabin, notes that two matters. One is that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu led like a procession with an effigy of Yitzhak Rabin in a coffin. And this is a picture of, he's maybe the number 2, number 3 man in the Knesset right now, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is he's of Iraqi Kurdish origin. This is a picture of him with the emblem from Yitzhak Rabin's car, and it says here in I believe this is Jerusalem Post, but I have the link for anyone who would like. He says, just like we got to his emblem, we can get to Rabin, Ben-Gvir said at the time, right? So Chris Hedges is friends with Rabin and his wife. His wife basically blames them for murdering him. So indirectly, of course, but yeah, it's a big turning point, and it's not spoken about enough, and it should be. So Carter's message, supported by research and original polling of the Carter Foundation, finds that most people in the region want peace. The people want peace, while many politicians do not want peace, or worse, they stand in the way of it. The few who do want peace often pay with their lives. Carter nonetheless shows that most Arab countries are willing to acknowledge the right of Israel to exist in peace. Like I said, at the Oslo Accords, all 23 countries along the 1967 borders, as stated in UN Resolution 242. When Carter himself became president, he said, everything here is a summary of Carter, or it's a direct quotation. I'll try and indicate when it's a quotation. So he himself says, since the United States had to play a strong role in any peace effort, I reviewed the official positions of my predecessors on the key issues. This is after he became president. Our nation's constant policy, and you'll hear this repeated and echoed throughout the book, had been predicated on a few United Nations Security Council resolutions, notably 242 in 1967, which is in appendix number 1 of his book, and 338 in 1973, 6 years later when it became contentious. That's reported in appendix 2 of his book. Approved unanimously and still applicable legally. This is there's a recent resolution confirming this, as you probably know, Paul. Their basic premise is that Israel's acquisition of territory by force is illegal, and that Israel must withdraw from the occupied territories. That Israel has the right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries. It would be so easy for America to enforce peace in Israel if the 22% of land was given back. And that the refugee problem must be settled, Carter says, and that the international community should assist with negotiations to achieve a just and durable peace in the Middle East. More specifically, he says, the U.S. policy was that Israeli settlements in the West Bank and Gaza were illegal obstacles to peace.
Yeah.
2 weeks later, President Sadat came to Washington. During a long private conversation, it became obvious that his inclination to work with me on peace negotiations was already well developed. He showed up with that intention. Menachem Begin replaced Yitzhak Rabin as prime minister a month later. Begin had put together a majority coalition that accepted the premise. I'd like to get back to some of the other slides here. So maybe around 20. Yeah, okay. That's Begin had put together a majority coalition that accepted the premise that the land in Gaza and the West Bank belonged rightfully to the state of Israel and should not be exchanged for a permanent peace agreement with the Arabs. Public opinion varied widely, but there was no doubt that in 1977 that a more hawkish attitude now prevailed in the government of Israel. Age and ethnic differences strongly favored the Likud over the labor alignment. Oriental Jews, known as Sephardim, whose families had come from the Middle East and Africa, gave, including places like Libya. I know when I say Libyan origin Jews, they have other elements, for instance, in their family line, but that's what he means by African. They're also Ethiopian and other Jews, which is also a point of contention about the sterilization that occurred. But he gave the Likud coalition parties a margin in 1977 through their rising numbers, and they were inclined to support a much more militant policy in dealing with the occupied territories. So Begin and his family suffered persecution in Eastern Europe and Siberia for his political activism as a Zionist. He was released from a Soviet prison and went to Palestine in 1942. He became the leader of a militant underground group called the Irgun. 2 or 3 core groups, the Haganah, the Irgun, the Stern Gang, these make up what an army like no other would term the army that then needed to form a state around it, which espoused the maximal demands of Zionism, Carter says. These included driving the British forces out of Palestine. He fought with every weapon available against the British, who branded him the preeminent terrorist in the region. A man of personal courage and single-minded devotion to his goals, he took pride in being a fighting Jew. End quote. Still, Carter found Begin willing to discuss the major goals of peace. I think Ariel Sharon was willing to offer the land for peace swap, and began working with Sadat. In the Camp David Accords, the premise was that peace with Egypt was a step towards a solution with the Palestinians. It wasn't.
So can I just ask about going back? I'm sure everyone have noticed this is the Palestine police force. A reward of so much money will be paid by the Palestinian government to any person giving information which leads directly to the apprehension of said person. So this states there was Palestine had a police force and a government. What year was this? Was this in the 1930s or 1920s, perhaps? Oh, 1940. So I beg your pardon. This is 1940. The mugshot, Hakim Begin. So this would suggest that before Israel was declared a state, there was a Palestine government with a police force.
Yes. Again, I have photographs that I haven't managed to get into this particular display, but of the opera houses, the societies of women for a particular topic. When you actually see the streets of Palestine, it's beautiful.
No, I wasn't talking about opera or the streets. I mean, it's the reference to the word government and the Palestine police force.
No,
this is the state rather than kind of civic institutions and stuff that is described as such in official documents.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
this is quite
rare. Yeah. I have travel travel literature written by Sufis like Sheikh Abdul Ghani and Nablus, right, from Nablus, and he ends up in Damascus. But he is, he has travel writings about Palestine and describes everything in great detail.
Of course.
And he refers to it as a distinct region with its own name.
Okay.
That history. Maybe in the future, a panelist can enlighten us even more than what we've been able to arrive at here. So, in the Camp David Accords, the premise was that peace with Egypt was a step. What was it? It was a step towards a solution with the Palestinians. And Begin insisted that the document should not merely state that autonomy in the end, after this process is completed, should be granted to the Palestinians, but full autonomy. Carter mentions that in the Brandeis book launch as well. And Carter carries on in his own words, "It is to be remembered that the Camp David Accords, signed by Sadat and Begin and officially ratified by both governments, reconfirmed a specific commitment to honor UN Resolution 242 and 338. In their own words. So they've committed to this. They've agreed to it. They have given their word to it, which prohibit the acquisition of land by force and call for Israel's withdrawal from the occupied territories. Furthermore, the accords, which Carter he led, generally recognized that continuing to treat non-Jews in the occupied territories as a substratum of society is contrary to the principles of morality and justice on which democracies are founded. Begin and Sadat agreed that the apparently insurmountable problems concerning Palestinian rights could be or would be overcome." So Sadat was condemned, but what he initiated was supposed to be a step to something that never happened and still hasn't happened. And for a long period, neither the Jordanians nor the PLO were willing to participate in peace talks. Obviously, Jordan's position has changed, confirming Israel's fears that their nation's existence would be threatened in the future at that time. So that's the threat that they felt. And Carter carries on, "For Menachem Begin, the peace treaty with Egypt was the treaty with Egypt was the significant act for Israel, while solemn promises regarding the West Bank and Palestinians would be finessed or deliberately violated. With the bilateral treaty, Israel removed Egypt's considerable strength from the military equation of the Middle East, and thus it permitted itself, with renewed freedom, to pursue the goals of a fervent and dedicated minority of its citizens to confiscate, settle, and fortify the occupied territories." As many people know, the kibbutzim they're walled and they're effectively like a military garrison. Israeli settlement activity still caused great concern in 1980. And because of that, UN Resolution 465 in Appendix 5 of Carter's book was passed, calling on Israel to dismantle existing settlements in the Arab territories occupied in 1967, including East Jerusalem, was passed. So, you know, the idea of settling, you're talking about inland, you're talking about farmland. You know, when we look at Tantora and the other areas that were taken in the Nakba, like Haifa, and these are seaports where the Palestinians are described as more European, their houses are more elegant. In the farmland, it's more like on the style of a Roman villa, where you have grapevines over a patio and, you know, people sitting out and drinking tea with their family as they watch their sheep and tend to their olive trees, 800,000 of which have been uprooted. So this is the growth of the settlements. You can see 1970, it's a few dots, 80, 90, 2000, 2010, 2016, you get more and more density, and that's not the problem. Carter will outline what the problem is, so I'll let him say it in his own words. The problem is that Palestinians end up needing to get travel permits to move about in their own land, and these settlements end up cutting up the rest of the area into what's been called cantons or bantustans. So you can see the settler population, in spite of pushback from the United States that supports Israel and protects them. You know, it's like, I don't remember if it was Scott Ritter or Colonel Douglas McGregor. They said the United States could end all of this with one phone call, but they don't. Some people would like, I don't remember if Carter himself says this, but there'd be too much political backlash from ADL and AIPAC. So I think we've talked a little bit about the UN Security Council already. The vetoes. This is the political support. But I want everyone to see that the position of the Likud party is public, right? The right of the Jewish people to the land of Israel is eternal and indisputable, and is linked with the right to security and peace. Therefore, Judea and Samaria, so that's the word I was looking for, Judea, will not be handed to any foreign administration. Between the sea and the Jordan, there will only be Israeli sovereignty.